The roofer beat the rain to my porch, shook off his jacket, and said, "Got a towel?" His voice was low, a gravelly thing that seemed to vibrate in the suddenly close air of the entryway. Rain lashed against the windows behind him, a frantic drumming that had chased him from the half-finished roof. He stood there, filling a space that had only ever known my own solitary shape, his shoulders broad under a damp flannel shirt. Water dripped from the ends of his dark hair, tracing paths down his temples and along the strong line of his jaw. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes, a deep and unreadable brown, held a kind of weary amusement. I just stared for a second, my own brain catching up to the reality of him. Cole. His name was Cole. He'd been a presence on my property for 3 days, a distant figure of methodical motion against the blue sky, but this was the first time he'd been inside. This close. Close enough for me to smell the scent of rain, damp earth, and something else, something clean and sharp, like sawdust and soap. "Yeah," I finally managed, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. "Yeah, of course." I turned and fled to the linen closet in the hallway, my heart thumping a stupid, panicked rhythm against my ribs. It was ridiculous. He was just a man, a contractor I'd hired to fix a leak that had been plaguing my attic for 2 winters. I pulled out the fluffiest towel I owned, a dark gray one I saved for myself, and walked back, holding it out like a peace offering. He took it, and his fingers brushed against mine. A simple, meaningless contact. But it felt like a spark, a tiny jolt of static electricity that shot up my arm. I pulled my hand back too quickly. I hoped he didn't notice. He probably didn't. He was busy rubbing the towel over his hair, his head bent, the muscles in his neck and back shifting under his shirt. I watched the movement, mesmerized. I had spent the last 3 days watching him from my office window, pretending to write while I cataloged the efficient, powerful way he moved. The way he could lift a bundle of shingles as if it were nothing. The focused set of his jaw as he measured a cut. He worked with a quiet competence that I, a man who spent his days wrestling with words that never seemed to fit together right, found deeply, almost intimidatingly, attractive. "Thanks," he said, looking up. He draped the towel over his shoulder. Came down faster than I thought it would. He gestured with his chin toward the window, where the world had become a churning gray blur. "Good thing we got the new underlayment down on that whole section. Should hold." "That's good," I said, nodding. We stood in a pocket of awkward silence, the storm filling the space between us. I should have offered him coffee. That was the normal, neighborly thing to do. But my throat felt tight. The thought of performing the casual ballet of hospitality, getting mugs, pouring coffee, making small talk, felt like an insurmountable task. He was just too much, too solid, too real in my quiet, dusty house. This house had been my grandparents'. I'd inherited it 3 years ago, trading a cramped city apartment for sprawling, empty rooms and a silence that had at first felt like a balm and had slowly curdled into a kind of low-grade loneliness I refused to name. I worked from home, writing technical manuals for software nobody would ever be excited about. My life was a series of quiet, predictable loops. Wake, work, eat, sleep. The arrival of Cole and his truck had been the most exciting thing to happen on this sleepy country road in months. He shifted his weight, his work boots making a soft, scuffing sound on the old hardwood floor. "Well, I guess I'll just wait it out here on the porch, if that's all right with you." "No," I said, the word coming out too loud. He raised an eyebrow. My face flushed with heat. "I mean, no, don't do that. You'll get soaked. You can wait in here. In the kitchen. I can make some coffee." There it was. The offer. Out in the world. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, gone almost as soon as it appeared. It changed his face entirely, softening the hard lines around his mouth. "Coffee sounds good. Thanks." I led the way, hyper-aware of him walking behind me. I felt his presence like a change in atmospheric pressure. The kitchen, usually my safe haven, suddenly felt small and cluttered. I swept a pile of mail off the small wooden table and gestured for him to sit. He didn't. He leaned against the counter instead, arms crossed over his chest, the damp towel still slung over one shoulder. He watched me as I moved, his gaze steady and quiet. My hands felt clumsy as I filled the coffee maker with water, my movements jerky and inefficient. I could feel him observing me, and it made me feel like an actor who had forgotten his lines. I was usually so adept at being alone, my motions fluid and thoughtless in their solitude. Now, every action felt scrutinized. I spilled a few coffee grounds on the counter and cursed myself internally. "Long day?" he asked. His voice was calm, cutting through the sound of the rain and the gurgle of the coffee maker. "Something like that," I mumbled, wiping the grounds away with a damp paper towel. "Just work." "What is it you do in there all day?" he asked, a hint of genuine curiosity in his tone. "See your light on pretty late sometimes when I'm packing up." My stomach did a nervous little flip. He'd noticed. He'd noticed my light. He'd noticed me. It was a completely innocuous observation, the kind anyone would make, but in the echo chamber of my own head, it felt significant, monumental. "I'm a writer," I said, turning to face him, leaning back against the opposite counter. It felt better to have the width of the small kitchen between us. "Technical writer. It's not as interesting as it sounds. Probably more interesting than roofing," he countered with a slight shrug. "I don't know," I said, and the words were honest. "There's something satisfying about it. What you do, you can see the progress. You start with a problem, a leak, and you end with something solid, something fixed. Tangible." I gestured vaguely with my hand. "Words are just air. You arrange them one way, then another. They're never really finished." He considered this for a moment, his dark eyes fixed on my face. I felt pinned by his attention. He didn't just hear words. He seemed to listen to them, to weigh them. It was unnerving. Most people just waited for their turn to talk. "Never thought of it like that," he said finally. "But I guess you're right. It's a good feeling. When a seam is straight and tight. Knowing it'll keep the water out for the next 30 years," he paused. "Still, rather be inside on a day like this." The coffee maker gave a final sigh, and I turned to pour 2 mugs. My hands were steadier now. The conversation, as simple as it was, had grounded me slightly. I set a mug on the counter in front of him. "Black. I'd guessed right." He wrapped his large, calloused hands around the warmth of the mug. I watched his fingers, the clean, short nails, the network of faint white scars across his knuckles. They were hands that knew work, hands that fixed things. We drank in silence for a few minutes, a comfortable quiet settling over us. The storm raged outside, but in my small kitchen, it felt distant, like a movie playing on a screen. It was just us. The thought sent a fresh wave of anxiety and something else, something warm and hopeful, through my chest. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of pine and wet earth. A weak sun was trying to burn through the remaining clouds. I was in my office, staring at a blinking cursor on my screen, when I heard the familiar rumble of Cole's truck coming up the long gravel driveway. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was just the lingering effect of yesterday's awkwardness, a social hangover, but I knew it was more than that. It was anticipation. I spent the morning watching him again. It had become a ritual. He moved across the roof with a dancer's grace, a surprising agility for a man his size. He was a silhouette against the brightening sky, a study in focused effort. My gaze would linger on the stretch of his shirt across his back as he leaned over, the sure-footed way he navigated the steep pitch of the roof. It felt voyeuristic, a secret I kept behind the safety of my window. I was cataloging him, learning the rhythm of his work, the set of his shoulders when he was concentrating, the way he'd pause and push a hand through his hair, staring out at the line of trees at the edge of my property. Around noon, I heard his boots on the porch steps. I'd left a cooler with a few bottles of water out for him the first day, a gesture that felt safely transactional. But today, the silence from the kitchen felt different. It felt like a void where yesterday's coffee had been. I found myself walking to the kitchen, my feet moving before my brain had fully committed to the idea. I made a sandwich for myself, turkey and Swiss on rye, my standard, boring lunch. And then, without really thinking about it, I made another one. Exactly the same. I put it on a plate next to a handful of chips and a pickle, and I carried it to the back door, my heart hammering. He was sitting on the top step of the porch, his back to me, drinking a bottle of water. "Cole," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He turned, his expression unreadable. I made too much lunch." I lied, the words feeling clumsy and obvious in my mouth. "Thought you might be hungry." I held out the plate. He looked from the plate to my face and then back again. For a terrifying second, I thought he was going to say no, that I had crossed some invisible line between client and contractor. But then his face softened, and that ghost of a smile appeared again. Yeah? Thanks. He took the plate, his fingers brushing mine again. This time, the contact was less of a jolt and more of a slow, spreading warmth. Smells good. He shifted over on the step, making room. It was a silent invitation. My mind screamed at me to retreat to the safety of my house, but my body betrayed me. I sat down, leaving a careful foot of space between us. We ate in silence for a while. The only sounds were the chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the quiet crunch of our sandwiches. It wasn't an awkward silence like the day before. It was peaceful, shared. "This is a nice spot," he said after a few minutes, looking out at the overgrown backyard and the dense woods beyond. "Quiet." "It is," I agreed. "Sometimes too quiet." The admission slipped out before I could stop it. It was more honest than I intended to be. He glanced at me, a quick, sidelong look. "I get that. Grew up in the city. Took me a while to get used to the quiet when I moved out this way. At first, it feels like something's missing. Then you start to hear all the other stuff. The stuff you couldn't hear before." I looked at him, surprised. It was the most he'd said about himself in all the days he'd been here. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the stoic facade, but it felt like a gift. "You don't seem like a city person," I said. He gave a low chuckle. "Yeah, well, I wasn't a very good one. Too many people. Too much noise." He finished his sandwich and leaned back on his elbows, stretching his long legs out on the steps below. The sun caught the highlights in his dark hair. He looked relaxed, at ease. It made me feel more at ease, too. "So, what kind of stuff do you write?" he asked, changing the subject back to me. "Right now, I'm writing a 400-page installation guide for a network security server," I said, and the flatness in my own voice made me wince. He laughed, a genuine, warm sound that startled me. "Okay, you were right. That does not sound interesting." I found myself smiling. A real smile. It pays the bills. It's logical. There are rules. A right way and a wrong way. It's predictable. "And you like predictable?" he asked. It wasn't a judgment, just a question. I thought about it. My whole life was built on a foundation of predictable. It was safe. It was controlled. It was also crushingly lonely. I said, the answer surprising me as much as it might have him. He didn't press. He just nodded slowly, his eyes on the horizon. We sat there a little longer, the space between us feeling less like a gulf and more like a comfortable, shared territory. When he finally stood up, brushing the crumbs from his jeans, he handed the empty plate back to me. "That was the best lunch I've had all week," he said. And his eyes, when they met mine, were warm and direct. There was no hidden meaning, no subtext I had to decode. It was just a simple, honest statement. But it made my chest feel tight with an emotion I couldn't quite name. The lunch became a daily ritual. I'd make 2 sandwiches, and we'd sit on the back steps and eat them in relative silence. Our conversations were never deep or revealing. We talked about the weather, the progress on the roof, a stubborn raccoon that kept getting into my trash. Small talk, but it felt significant. It was the creation of a routine, a tiny intersection in our separate lives. I learned small things about him. He liked his coffee black and his sandwiches with extra mustard. He had a younger sister who lived in Oregon. He'd driven across the country once, just because he wanted to see the mountains. Each detail was a small, smooth stone-eyed pocket and examined later in the quiet of my house. The more time I spent in his presence, the more my internal world began to shift. The silence of the house no longer felt merely lonely, it felt empty. It was an absence of him. I found myself listening for the sound of his truck in the morning, my day not truly beginning until I heard it. My writing suffered. I'd sit at my desk, my gaze drifting to the window, searching for his form on the roof. I was orbiting him, my quiet life reoriented around this new, unexpected sun. One afternoon, I was carrying our plates back inside when I tripped on the uneven threshold of the door. The plates flew from my hands, crashing to the wooden floor of the kitchen. I stumbled forward, my arms windmilling, and a strong hand clamped onto my bicep, steadying me. It was Cole. He had followed me in. "Whoa, careful there," he said, his voice low and close to my ear. His hand was warm and solid on my arm, his fingers pressing into the muscle. I froze, my body rigid. He was standing directly behind me, his chest a wall of warmth against my back. I could feel his breath on my neck. My own breathing hitched. Time seemed to slow down. I was intensely aware of every point of contact between us. His hand on my arm, his body against mine. The scent of him, sunscreen and sweat, and that clean, sharp soap smell filled my senses. My mind, usually a chaotic buzz of analysis and anxiety, went completely silent. There was only this proximity, this feeling. He held me there for a second too long. A beat, 2 beats. It was a space of time that stretched into an eternity, filled with unspoken things. I could feel the steady thud of his heart against my shoulder blades. Or maybe it was my own, hammering so hard I could feel it everywhere. Then, as quickly as it happened, it was over. He released me and took a step back. The space where he had been was suddenly cold. "You okay?" he asked, his voice a little rough. I couldn't look at him. I stared down at the shattered remains of the plates on the floor. "Yeah, fine. Just clumsy." My voice was shaky. "Here, let me help." Before I could protest, he was crouching down, carefully picking up the larger pieces of ceramic. I knelt down as well, my hands trembling as I gathered the smaller shards. We worked in silence, our shoulders occasionally brushing. Each accidental touch was a fresh shock to my system. When we had cleared the floor, we stood up at the same time, the small space of the kitchen suddenly feeling charged, electric. He had a small cut on his thumb where a sharp edge had caught him. A single, perfect bead of red welled up on the surface. Without thinking, I reached out and took his hand. My fingers were cold against his warm skin. I turned his hand over, examining the small wound. "You're bleeding," I said, my voice hushed. He didn't pull away. He just stood there, letting me hold his hand, his gaze fixed on our joined fingers. I could feel the rough texture of his calluses against my palm. I am holding his hand. The thought is a thunderclap in the quiet of my mind. I am standing in my kitchen, holding my roofer's hand. My thumb moved of its own accord, gently brushing against the cut. He sucked in a sharp breath. My eyes shot up to his face. He was looking at me, his expression intense, his lips slightly parted. The air crackled. The world narrowed to the few inches between our faces. I saw something in his eyes then, something I hadn't seen before. Not just politeness or casual curiosity. It was a reflection of my own yearning, a deep, quiet hunger that mirrored the one I'd been hiding for so long. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate bird. This is it. This is the moment. But the moment broke. He cleared his throat and gently pulled his hand from my grasp. The loss of contact was a physical ache. "It's just a scratch," he said, his voice strained. He turned and grabbed a paper towel, pressing it against his thumb. I should get back to it. Need to finish that flashing before the end of the day." He was gone before I could say anything, the screen door banging shut behind him. I stood alone in the kitchen, my hand still tingling where it had touched his. I brought my fingers to my lips, trying to hold on to the phantom sensation of his skin. The silence he left behind was heavier than ever before, thick with everything that had not been said, everything that had not been done. The work on the roof was almost finished. I knew this because the rhythmic thud of the nail gun had been replaced by quieter, more meticulous sounds. I also knew it because Cole had told me. "Should be wrapped up by tomorrow afternoon," he'd said during our lunch, his tone carefully neutral. We had avoided any mention of the moment in the kitchen. We had retreated back to the safety of small talk, but the space between us was no longer comfortable. It was taut, a wire stretched to its breaking point. Every glance felt loaded. Every silence was filled with the memory of his hand in mine. I dreaded his leaving. The thought of the house returning to its empty silence was a physical pain in my chest. He had, in the course of a week and a half, become the center of my small universe. His absence would be a crater. That evening, the sky began to bruise with the promise of another storm. The air grew heavy and thick, the kind of oppressive humidity that precedes a summer downpour. I watched from my office window as Cole worked with a renewed urgency, trying to beat the weather. He was securing the final ridge cap, his movements sure and economical even as the wind began to pick up, whipping the leaves on the trees into a frenzy. I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. He was so high up, so exposed. The first drops of rain, fat and heavy, began to splatter against the window pane. I saw him finish his task, gather his tools, and begin his careful descent down the ladder just as the sky opened up. It wasn't a gentle rain this time. It was a deluge. A torrent of water that blurred the landscape and hammered against the roof. The new, solid, perfectly sealed roof, with a deafening roar. I heard his boots hit the porch with a thud, followed by a sharp knock on the door. When I opened it, he was standing there, completely and utterly soaked. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his t-shirt clung to his chest, outlining the hard muscles of his torso. He was shivering slightly. "Sorry to bother you again," he said, his teeth chattering a little. "This one really came out of nowhere. Can I just wait it out for a minute?" "Of course," I said, stepping back to let him in. "Get in here. You're soaked." He dripped on the entryway floor, a puddle forming at his feet. He ran a hand over his face, wiping away the water. "I think this is the end of my workday," he said, managing a weak smile. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," I said, the words coming out before I could think about their implication. "You'll catch a cold." His eyes met mine, and the air between us was suddenly thick with the unspoken. "I don't have anything else to wear," he said, his voice quiet. "I do," I said, my heart pounding. "I mean, I have clothes. They might fit. You're taller, but it's better than nothing." He hesitated for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "Okay, thank you." I led him upstairs to my bedroom, a room he had never seen, a space that felt intensely personal. The house was growing dark as the storm clouds blotted out the last of the evening light. I rummaged through my dresser, my hands shaking slightly, and pulled out a pair of gray sweatpants and an old, soft t-shirt. "Here," I said, holding them out to him. "The bathroom is just across the hall. You can leave your wet things in there." "Thanks," he said again, his voice low. He took the clothes, his fingers brushing mine. That familiar spark. This time, neither of us pulled away immediately. His gaze held mine, and the world seemed to stop. The only sound was the drumming of the rain and the frantic beating of my own heart. Then the lights flickered, once, twice, and went out. We were plunged into a sudden, deep darkness. I let out a small, involuntary gasp. "Power's out," Cole stated, his voice calm and steady in the blackness. It was a comforting sound, a solid anchor in the disorienting dark. "I have candles," I said, my voice sounding small. "Downstairs. In the kitchen." "Stay here," he said. His voice was closer now. I felt a gentle touch on my arm, just his fingertips, but it was enough to make my breath catch. "Don't want you tripping on the stairs in the dark. I've got a flashlight in my truck. I'll be right back." I heard him move past me, his steps sure and confident even in the pitch black. I listened to his footsteps descending the stairs, the front door opening and closing, and then I was alone in the dark, my mind racing. He was back in a minute, a powerful beam of light cutting through the gloom. He played it around the hallway, then handed it to me. "Here, you find the candles. I'm going to change." I nodded, even though he probably couldn't see the gesture. I made my way downstairs, the flashlight beam bobbing in front of me, creating dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. I found the candles and a book of matches in a kitchen drawer. By the time I had a few of them lit, casting a warm, flickering glow around the room, Cole came back downstairs. He was wearing my clothes. The sweatpants were a little too short, ending just above his ankles, and the t-shirt was snug across his broad chest and shoulders. Seeing him in my clothes, in my house, in the intimate, golden light of the candles, did something strange to my insides. It felt domestic. It felt right. He had his wet clothes bundled in his arms. "Where can I put these?" "Just on the floor by the door is fine," I said, my voice a little hoarse. He set them down and then walked over to the kitchen table, where I had placed the candles. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind howling around the corners of the house. "Quite a storm," he said, his voice quiet. He was looking at me, his face half in shadow, half in flickering light. The unreadable expression was back in his eyes, but it was deeper now, charged with the intimacy of our situation. "Yeah," I whispered. We stood there in silence. The wire of tension that had been between us for days was now humming with an almost unbearable frequency. All the barriers were gone. There was no roof to fix, no client-contractor relationship to maintain. There was just us, two men, alone in a dark house, surrounded by a storm. I am looking at him, and he is looking at me. The air is thick, and I can't breathe. My entire life, I have been an observer, standing on the sidelines, afraid to step onto the field. I build walls of predictable routine and quiet solitude to protect myself from what? From this. From this terrifying, exhilarating feeling. From the possibility of connection. From the risk of rejection. He takes a step toward me. My heart is a frantic drum against my ribs. I can't move. I can't speak. All I can do is watch him. He stops when he is just an arm's length away. The candlelight dances in his dark eyes, and I can see it now. The vulnerability. The question. He's as uncertain as I am. He is the one who acts, the one who fixes things, but in this, he is waiting. He is waiting for a signal from me. And in that moment, I understand. He hasn't been oblivious. He has been careful. He has been respectful of my space, of my quiet, of the invisible walls I erect around myself. He has been waiting for me to let him in. You live out here all alone? He asks, his voice barely a whisper, but it's a thunderclap in the silent room. It's the same question he asked before, but this time it means something different. It's not about logistics. It's about me. I can only manage a nod. Do you get lonely? He asks, his gaze so intense it feels like a physical touch. My carefully constructed defenses crumble. The truth, raw and unvarnished, rises in my throat. All the time, I whisper, the admission hanging in the air between us, fragile and real. His expression softens. A world of empathy, of understanding, passes through his eyes. He takes another step, closing the remaining distance between us. He slowly, deliberately, lifts his hand. I watch it, mesmerized, as it comes toward my face. I flinch, just slightly, an old, ingrained instinct. His hand stills for a fraction of a second, and then his fingers, warm and calloused, gently cup my jaw. His thumb strokes my cheek. A slow, soothing motion. Me too, he says, his voice thick with an emotion I can't decipher. And that's it. That's the breaking point. The dam inside me bursts, and a decade of loneliness and unspoken yearning comes pouring out. I don't plan it. The words are just there, escaping from me in a rush. I don't want you to finish the roof. I say, the words nonsensical, desperate. Because then you'll leave. A tear I didn't know was there escapes and traces a hot path down my cheek. He catches it with his thumb. He doesn't say anything. He just looks at me, his eyes searching my face. He leans in, and for one heart-stopping moment, I think he's going to kiss me. But he stops, his forehead coming to rest against mine. We stand there, breathing the same air, his hand warm on my face, my hands pressed flat against his chest. I can feel the steady, strong beat of his heart under my palm. It's a comforting rhythm, a solid, living thing. I don't want to leave, he says, his voice a low rumble that vibrates through my entire body. He pulls back just enough to look at me. His eyes drop to my lips, then back to my eyes. A silent question. I give him the answer with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. And then he kisses me. It is not a kiss of frantic passion or desperate hunger. It is slow. It is gentle. It is a question and an answer all at once. His lips are soft, hesitant at first, then growing firmer as I lean into him, my hands sliding up from his chest to wrap around his neck. He tastes of coffee and rain. It is the most honest thing I have ever felt. It is not rushed. It is not for show. It is real. One of his hands moves from my jaw to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me to him. His other arm wraps around my waist, pulling me flush against his body. I feel the solid strength of him, the warmth of him, and I melt into it. I feel safe. For the first time in a very, very long time, I feel completely and utterly safe. When we finally break apart, we are both breathless. We don't speak. We just stand there, wrapped in each other's arms, our foreheads pressed together again. The storm rages on outside, but in here, in the small, flickering circle of candlelight, there is only a profound and overwhelming sense of peace. He laces his fingers through mine, his large hand enveloping my own. A new connection. Solid. Tangible. Something fixed. I woke to the unfamiliar sensation of sunlight on my face. It streamed through the window, bright and insistent. For a moment, I was disoriented. The house was quiet. Too quiet. My eyes snapped open. I was in my own bed, tangled in my own sheets. Alone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. He was gone. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. The candles in the kitchen had burned down to puddles of wax. The power was back on, The digital clock on my bedside table glowed with the time, 7:13 a.m. The storm was over. And so, I thought with a crushing sense of dread, was whatever had happened between us. It was a dream. A strange, beautiful fever dream brought on by the storm and the darkness. He had woken up in the clear light of day, realized his mistake, and fled. My throat felt tight. I swung my legs out of bed, my movements jerky. I was still wearing yesterday's clothes. I hadn't even changed. We had talked. After the kiss, we had talked for hours, sitting at the kitchen table, our hands linked. We talked until the candles burned low and our voices grew hoarse. Then he had walked me upstairs, kissed me goodnight at my bedroom door with a tenderness that made my knees weak, and had gone to sleep on the couch. I crept out of my room, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The door to the bathroom was open. His damp clothes were gone. I went downstairs, my stomach twisting into a painful knot. The living room was empty. The couch cushions were neat. The blanket I'd given him folded carefully and placed on one end. His work boots were gone from the entryway. He was gone. I leaned against the wall, the relief and hope of the previous night curdling into a familiar, bitter disappointment. Of course he was gone. What did I expect? I was a fool. A lonely, foolish man who had read too much into a moment of shared vulnerability. He was probably halfway home by now, shaking his head at his own lapse in judgment, regretting the entire thing. The silence of the house pressed in on me, heavier and more suffocating than ever before. It was no longer just an absence of sound. It was the absence of him. I walked into the kitchen, my body feeling heavy, my movements sluggish. The scent of coffee hit me. My gaze fell on the coffee maker. A fresh pot had been brewed. And next to it, on the counter, was a single, clean mug. And next to the mug was a small, folded piece of paper. My hand trembled as I reached for it. It was a page torn from the small notepad I kept by the phone. Unfolding it, I saw a few lines written in a strong, clear script. Went to grab my tools from the truck. Be back in a minute. See. I read the words once. Twice. A third time. The knot in my stomach slowly, miraculously, began to unwind. He hadn't left. He was coming back. He had made coffee. The sheer, breathtaking domesticity of the act made my eyes burn. He had woken up in my house, made coffee for us, and left me a note. I poured myself a cup, my hands still shaking, but for a different reason now. It was relief. A dizzying, overwhelming wave of it. I leaned against the counter, sipping the hot, strong coffee. It was perfect. Of course it was. Just then, I heard the familiar rumble of his truck coming back up the driveway. I watched through the kitchen window as he parked, got out, and started walking toward the house. He wasn't carrying any tools. He was just walking. He looked up and saw me in the window. He stopped. Our eyes met across the stretch of lawn. He gave me a small, hesitant smile. I smiled back. He came inside, the screen door closing softly behind him. We stood there for a moment, on opposite sides of the kitchen, the morning sun slanting between us. The awkwardness was back, but it was different now. It was the shyness of a new beginning, not the tension of an ending. "Morning," he said, his voice a little rough. "Morning," I replied, my voice quiet. I thought you'd left." His expression softened with understanding. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I wasn't going to just leave." He walked over to the counter and poured himself a mug of coffee. "Didn't sleep much last night," he said, his back to me. But not in a bad way. He turned around, leaning against the counter, cradling his mug. "I've been wanting to kiss you since that first day you brought me a sandwich," he said, the admission so direct, so honest, it took my breath away. I wasn't sure. You're a hard person to read." "I'm not," I said, a humorless laugh escaping me. "I'm an open book. It's just a very boring book." "It's not boring," he said, his gaze serious. "It's quiet. There's a difference." He took a sip of his coffee. "I'm not good with words, like you are. I don't know how to say all this stuff. But last night, that was real for me." He was giving me an opening, a chance to back out, a chance to say it was just the storm, just a mistake. The old me, the fearful, self-sabotaging me, would have taken it. I would have mumbled something about it being confusing and retreated back into my shell. But something had shifted in me. The foundation had cracked. He had cracked it. I put my mug down and walked over to him, stopping just in front of him. I reached out and took his free hand, lacing my fingers through his. His skin was warm, solid, real. It was real for me, too, I said, my voice clear and steady. Relief washed over his face, so palpable it was like watching the sun break through the clouds. He brought my hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. The final day of the job was strange. He worked on the roof, completing the last few tasks, and I sat at my desk, actually writing. But the dynamic had changed completely. There was no more secret observation, no more anxious analysis. There was a quiet hum of awareness between us, a connection that stretched from the roof to my office window. We ate lunch together on the back steps, our shoulders brushing, his thigh resting comfortably against mine. We didn't talk much, but the silence was full and content. Late in the afternoon, he came to the door, his tools packed, his truck loaded. This was it. The test. The job was done. The transaction was complete. He was holding the final invoice in his hand. My chest tightened with a familiar dread. All finished, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Looks great, I said, matching his tone. I took the invoice and wrote him a check, my hand steady despite the turmoil inside me. I handed it to him. Our fingers brushed. We both froze for a second. Well, he said, clearing his throat and tucking the check into his pocket. Guess that's it. Yeah, I said, my voice hollow. Thank you. For the roof. You're welcome. He stood there, hesitating. I could see the conflict in his eyes. He was a professional. This was the end of the job. But we were something else. He was waiting for me to say something, and I was waiting for him. A stupid, silent standoff. He finally broke it. Okay, well, take care, he said, turning to leave. I watched him walk down the porch steps. Each step was a hammer blow to my heart. He was leaving. It was over before it even began. I had been a fool to hope. He got to his truck and opened the driver's side door. He paused, his hand on the handle, and looked back at me. I was just standing in the doorway, my face a mask of disappointment I was too tired to hide. He sighed, a long, frustrated sound that I could hear even from that distance. He shook his head, as if at his own stupidity, and then he slammed the truck door shut. He walked back toward me, his strides long and purposeful. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of me on the porch. He cupped my face in his hands, his expression a mixture of exasperation and affection. This is ridiculous, he said. And then he kissed me again, right there on my front porch in the broad daylight. It was a firm, possessive kiss that left no room for doubt. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a statement. When he pulled away, he rested his forehead against mine. I'm a roofer, he said, as if explaining something very simple to a very slow child. My job is to fix things that are broken. And you and me, we're not broken. We're just getting started. He took a step back, a real, genuine smile finally spreading across his face. It lit up his eyes. My roof doesn't leak, he said. How about you let me take you out to dinner tonight? To celebrate yours not leaking either. A laugh, bright and full of relief, bubbled up out of my chest. I'd like that, I said. I'd like that a lot. We didn't go out to dinner that night. I cooked. We ate at my small kitchen table, the candlelight soft and voluntary this time. Later, we sat on the back steps, the same steps where we'd had our first stilted lunch, and watched the stars come out. He put his arm around me, and I leaned my head on his solid shoulder. The silence was perfect. It was filled not with loneliness, but with a quiet, comfortable presence. He stayed the night, and the next. The days that followed blurred into a gentle routine of shared coffees, quiet conversations, and the simple, profound comfort of another person's presence. His truck became a permanent fixture in my driveway. Some of his clothes found their way into my closet, hanging next to my own. The house no longer felt empty. It felt full. It felt like a home. One evening, a few weeks later, we were sitting on the porch swing he'd insisted on fixing. The air was cool, and the sky was painted with the soft pink and orange hues of sunset. I was leaning against him, his arm a warm, heavy weight around my shoulders. I thought back to the man I was before he'd shown up on my porch, soaked and asking for a towel. That man was an observer, a ghost in his own life, convinced that the quiet grayness was all he deserved. Cole's presence hadn't been a storm that tore my life apart. It had been a slow, steady rain that had seeped into the dry, cracked earth of my heart and brought something new to life. He hadn't demanded I change. He had simply made a space for me to grow. He turned his head and pressed a soft kiss to my temple. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against my ear. I smiled, a real, easy smile that reached my eyes. I looked out at the line of trees at the edge of the property, the same view I had stared at for years, feeling utterly alone. But now, I saw it differently. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. "Nothing," I said, snuggling closer into his side. "Everything." I was no longer just watching. I was here. I was present. I was safe. And for the first time, I felt like I'd finally come home.